Hey guys, in this video, I wanted to take a few minutes to demonstrate how to receive an invoice payment in Service Fusion using the FusionPay by Service Fusion integration. So this process actually starts once you're inside of the invoice. I wanted to start this process from the job level just to show a couple of different things. As you know, there's two different types of payments that you can receive in Service Fusion. I always like to show that in the accounting drop-down menu. On this right-hand side, you can see there's two different views for payments, one being an invoice payment. That's what we'll take a look at today. And the other is going to be a job deposit type of payment that you can receive in Service Fusion. So specifically for invoice payments, you'll know that the invoice payment is the proper form of payment to receive whenever there's an invoice present against the job. A job deposit, of course, kind of lives in opposition to that. That's the correct form of payment to receive if an invoice does not yet exist against the job. When an invoice does, it's very easy to tell, and it's always advantageous, especially considering the QuickBooks integration and the consequence of receiving a job deposit versus an invoice payment. The consequence of doing that incorrectly on the QuickBooks side of things certainly does have an effect, and we want to make sure that we minimize any of those effects by receiving the proper form of payment initially. So anytime that you see a job that has this, where there's an invoice present, that's when an invoice payment is the proper form of payment to receive. And when an invoice does exist against a job, it's very easy to navigate to the invoice. You simply select to click on that invoice number, and then you can see, yes, we do have this invoice, and now we can receive a payment against this invoice. Very similar to receiving a job deposit, that receive payment function exists as an action icon also in the top right corner when viewing an invoice. Guys, we do want to make sure that we are in view mode on this invoice. That lives in direct opposition to being in edit mode for this invoice. When you're in edit mode, you won't see the presence of the action icons in the top right corner of the screen because that invoice is still in a kind of a dynamic state. This is where I can also choose to distribute this invoice via email, via text message, and I can't do that if I'm actively editing one of the fields. So we want to make sure that we're in view invoice. That allows this invoice to be static, and therefore we can access the action icons associated with this invoice. And then guys, today we'll take a look at receiving an invoice payment directly from this invoice in the receive payments section of the invoice using that action icon. So here you can see that yes, we have received a job deposit against this job, and we'll take a look in a separate video how to convert that job deposit into an invoice payment as is appropriate once an invoice does exist. But now I can also see the total due associated with this invoice, and that allows me to set the stage to process a receive payment from my customer using the FusionPay by Service Fusion integration. So I would initiate this action by choosing the receive payment action icon. And then instead of seeing a dialog appear on screen very similar to a job deposit, instead with an invoice payment, I'm actually brought to a receive a payment screen. And by default, this is pointed to the invoice, which of course then by default is pointed to the job. It assumes that I'm paying the full amount, but I could always overwrite this value and choose a partial amount if that was necessary. But the first thing I want to do, guys, is make sure that I change the payment method to be one of the payment methods that's associated with the FusionPay by Service Fusion integration. Guys, there's another video on that, so take a look if you're not aware of the payment methods that are associated with FusionPay. But in this case, we'll simply choose MasterCard. That's going to be our selected payment method. We know this customer will have a card on file because we see once we select our payment method to be one of the payment methods that's associated with the FusionPay integration, we see the fields beneath that payment method change. The first one, of course, being the card number. Guys, I could absolutely simply start typing in this field, and then that would allow me to add new. I can select the option to add new as well, and this will allow me then to start typing to insert that card number there. Or I can simply select a card that's already on file for this customer. When I select a card that's already on file, we can see the associated information becomes automatically populated into the associated fields. I'm not exposed from a security standpoint of the entirety of the card number, instead just the card type as well as the last 4 digits of the card. And then I could choose to enter a payment memo here. I could choose to say something to the effect of final payments. If there was something that may be more applicable to this specific payment, I certainly have the opportunity to put this information in the payment memo section, even though I'm using that FusionPay integration by Service Fusion. I can also choose to change the amount of the payment. Again, it would allow me to accept a partial payment. For this example, we'll simply choose to pay the total due, and we can see that summarized after we process this payment. Then we'll actually have $0 owed after the payment. Notice, guys, I could choose to a different amount to apply. So different than the amount of the payment that's being processed. This is a field that has implications with the financial sync. So our integration with the QuickBooks file. By default, this will default to the total of the payment that's being processed, and certainly recommended to always let that value match, and that will minimize any effects to to our QuickBooks integration. So once I have that information entered, I would simply choose to submit the payment transaction. Of course, this lives underneath the summary, underneath the application amount as well. And we simply choose to submit the payment transaction. We'll notice a slight hesitation of the screen. The screen will refresh. I now see that I'm in a view mode on this payment as opposed to an active edit mode, which is what the receive a payment screen functions as. I can see the identified selected customer that I received payment from. I now see a date and a timestamp associated with this payment. I can see it was entered 3/29/11/03, and then what the Service Fusion username was that was logged in that processed the payment. I can also see some associated information that gets populated as a result of the integration, specifically that transaction token, as well as an authorization number. And then not for nothing, guys, from this screen, I could then travel back to my invoice very quickly, travel to the job, or for any reason I needed to investigate information in the customer profile. I certainly have a quick link that would allow me to do that as well. But guys, it really is that easy. That's how we receive an invoice type payment using the FusionPay integration by Service Fusion.